Добрый день, глубокоуважаемые коллеги и гости. Позвольте заседание Диссертационного совета по защите диссертации Мокшина Юлии Львовны на соискание ученой степени кандидата педагогических наук по специальности 13-2001 «Общая педагогика. История педагогики и образования» на тему «Fanfiction как инструмент приобщения современных школьников к чтению классической литературы» считать открытым. Приказом Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета от 1 апреля 2019 года номер 2864/1 Казакова Елена Ивановна, доктор педагогических наук, профессор кафедры педагогики Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета, назначена председателем данного диссертационного совета. Также разрешите представить моих коллег, членов совета. Илюшин Леонид Сергеевич, доктор педагогических наук, профессор кафедры педагогики Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета. Даринская Лариса Александровна, доктор педагогических наук, профессор кафедры психологии, образования и педагогики Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета. Свирина Наталья Михайловна, доктор педагогических наук, Российского государственного педагогического университета имени Александра Ивановича Герцена. В удаленном режиме у нас работает Джолдазбекова Баян Умирбековна, доктор филологических наук, заведующая кафедрой русской филологии и мировой литературы, Казахский национальный университет имени Аль-Фараби. Мы приветствуем вас. Сначала хотелось бы особо отметить, что согласно федеральному закону от 23 августа 1996 года, номер 127, о науке и государственной научно-технической политике, Санкт-Петербургский государственный университет получил право самостоятельно присуждать ученые степени.
Dear colleagues, we have to make a break. Unfortunately, we don't have the English broadcast.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Let us consider the Dissertation Council meeting on the defense of Mokshina Yulia Lvovna for the degree of candidate of education, qualification code 13.00.01, theory of education, history of teaching and education on theme, a fan-fiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, consider open. Due to the order of St. Petersburg State University as of the 1st of April 2019, number 2864/1, I, Kazakova Elena Ivanovna, Doctor of Education, Professor at the Department of Pedagogy of St. Petersburg State University, was positioned as the Madam Chair of the Dissertation Council, and let me introduce my colleagues. Ilюшин Leonid, Doctor of Education, Professor at the Department of Education, St. Petersburg State University. Darinskaya Larisa, Doctor of Education, Professor, Department of Educational Psychology and Pedagogy, St. Petersburg State University. Svirina Natalia, Doctor of Education, Professor, Department of Basic and Secondary General Education, St. Petersburg Academy of Postdoctoral Education. Chernyak Maria, Doctor of Philology, Professor at the Department of Russian Literature at the Russian State Herzen Pedagogical University. In the remote mode is Dolzalsbekova Bayan, Doctor of Philology, Head of the Department of the Russian and World Literature, Al-Farabi Kazakh National University. And first, I would like to highlight that due to the federal law as of 23rd of August 1996, number 127, on science and state science and technical policy, St. Petersburg State University was given the right to independently award scientific degrees. The correspondent order on awarding degrees in St. Petersburg State University, on the basis of which we have our council meeting, was issued on the 1st of September 2016, number 6221/1. In accordance with the order, the Dissertation Council meeting is considered valid if not less than 2/3 of the Dissertation Council members takes place, but not less than 4 people are present. Our Dissertation Council is comprised of 6 members. They all are present, and in the remote we have 1 Dissertation Council member. We have audio and visual contact with the member, so there is the quorum. I would like to set the following agenda for today's Dissertation Council meeting. It will last not more than 2 hours. The short report of the chairperson about the applicant's documents and its compliance with the regulations and answers for the possible questions, 5 minutes. Brief report of the applicant with the main positions of the dissertation, 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant due to the report, not more than 2 minutes per 1 question. Answers of the applicant. The reports of all the members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews and their positions, with questions and interventions to the applicant, not more than 10 minutes per each person. The chairperson's report, the answers of the applicant on the questions and interventions of the Dissertation Council members, not more than 15 minutes. Open discussion. The interventions by the guests present with a brief outline of their positions and questions and suggestions to the applicant, strictly due to the topic of the research. Not more than 5 minutes for each person. Please register in the registration form, and before the intervention, please introduce yourself. The final answers of the applicant, not more than 5 minutes. The report by the scientific consultant, not more than 3 minutes. 5-minute discussion before the open roll call for making a conclusion on whether to award or not the scientific degree of St. Petersburg State University to the applicant. And during this discussion, the broadcast is off. Open roll call. The counting of votes by the chairperson with filling in the form of the minutes of meeting, the decision on whether to award or not the scientific degree of the St. Petersburg State University, the final report of the applicant, not more than 2 minutes. If everything is clear to everyone, before we start the implementation of our agenda, I remind you to turn off your mobile phones. Thank you for understanding. I would like also to inform that audio and video record of our meeting is being recorded, as well as the live broadcast at the website of St. Petersburg State University. The simultaneous translation is provided from Russian into English in our case. And now I would like to start our meeting, and we shift to the first point of our agenda, that is the brief report of the chairperson. Dissertation by Mokshina Yulia Lvovna for the degree of candidate of pedagogical sciences, qualification code 13.00.01, theory of education, history of teaching and education, on the topic of fanfiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, was adopted for defense due to the Secretary's order as of the 1st of April 2019. The Dissertation Council was approved by the order of the Scientific Secretary as of April the 1st, 2019, number 2864/1. And dear colleagues and guests, I have presented the Dissertation Council to you already. The applicant presented to the Scientific Secretary of St. Petersburg State University the following documents: the application to the Rector of St. Petersburg State University, Professor Kropotchev, on the dissertation's application as of 7th of December 2018, the review from the scientific consultant Galaktionovai Tatyana Gelievny, Doctor of Pedagogy, Professor at the Department of Pedagogy, St. Petersburg State University. A list of publications with 5 works with the main provisions of the dissertation, 4 articles in the peer-reviewed of the list approved by the Ministry of Education by the Russian Federation, and 1 article in the peer-reviewed journal from the international quotation basis. The certificate of the candidate exams as of the 8th of July 2019, issued by Kalushsky State University, that stating that Mokshina Yulia has passed the exams in the theory of education, history of teaching, and education, history and philosophy with a good result, English with the excellent result, and general pedagogic with the excellent result. A diploma of the completion of the master's course issued on the 10th of July 2019, stating that Mokshina Yulia finalized the master's course as of the 13th June 2019, philology with the academic degree of master. Dissertation in Russian and English in the hard copy, and in the electronic copy the dissertation complies with the regulations of GOST. It is printed with all the reference data according to GOST. It is necessary to mention that all the documents comply with provision 12, paragraph 3, as of the Scientific State University. Now I would like to give the floor to the applicant with a brief report. Please, Yulia Lvovna, you are welcome. Dear colleagues, dear chairperson, dear council members, I would like to present the candidate dissertation, a fan-fiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature. Relevance of the thesis topic is conditioned by the following tendencies. The continuing tendency of modern school children to have no expressed interest in reading, including classical literature, confirmed by sociological and pedagogical research. Secondly, the development of information culture of the 21st century, which determines the emergence of new online literary phenomena and readers' practices which fascinate modern teenagers but are not studied from a pedagogical point of view. Thirdly, the lack of modern pedagogical tools that can complement the traditional ideas about the possible ways to solve the problem of modern school children to read classical literature. These factors have led to the choice of the theme of the dissertation research, the key concept of which is a fan fiction, a genre of literature, derivative work of literature based on an original work. The study of the literary nature of fan fiction allowed the author to assume that this phenomenon may include the educational potential for the introduction of modern students to reading classical literature and be an effective pedagogical tool, provided that its primary sources for the texts of fan fiction will be used highly fictional literary works. The organization of school children's activities will assume the possibility of their creative independence. The development of the reader community is interested in with the rules of fan fiction and the necessity of this experience. Thus, the hypothesis of the dissertation research was created and its purpose, object, subject, and tasks were formulated. Allow me to present the thesis defense provisions in the logic of solving the main tasks. To confirm the hypothesis and the solution of the first problem, the author studied numerous foreign scientific works devoted to the study of social and cultural peculiarities of fan fiction, as a result of which it was found out that fan fiction is a multifunctional concept which can be used to denote the genre of amateur literature created on the basis of primary sources, and on the other hand to denote an open creative space in the Internet. The development of the socio-cultural phenomenon on fan fiction is provided for the 20th and 21st centuries. Modern fan fiction is a vast virtual reader community bringing together representatives of modern culture of various social and age groups, not indifferent to reading works of popular and world literature and experiencing the need for reader communication. Such communities have specific institutional structure and apply jointly activity of the authors, editors, critics, and readers of fan fiction texts based on certain norms and rules established by the members of readers' communities themselves. To confirm the assumptions that the fan fiction has an educational potential and can be used as a pedagogical tool at school, and solve the second task of the dissertation, the analysis of existing foresight projects, documents in the field of education, identify the main trends and vectors of modern school education development, the special importance of the children's and youth reading in Russia, and other documents, culture fixed in federal standards, programs of support of children and youth reading in the Russian Federation, and other documents were determined. Comparison of the received data with theoretical conclusions about fan fiction as a social cultural phenomenon allowed the author of the thesis to come to the conclusion that fan fiction can be used as a pedagogical tool to solve a number of problems facing modern school education and include the necessary educational potential to solve the problem of initiation to reading on the basis that fan fiction assumes the formation of communities of enthusiastic readers and the development of reader communication. Virtual fan fiction communities involve participants into creativity, and the space opens the possibilities for cooperation of readers. In order to check the received data and solving the third task of the dissertation, the author conducted a pilot study which included a survey and questionnaires of modern students and teachers to determine their attitude to fan fiction as a social cultural phenomenon and the possibility of using this phenomenon as a pedagogical tool to introduce to the reading of classical literature. The criterion for choosing the the participants of the research, modern school children, was their involvement in the activities of different communities of fan fiction. Respondents were 50 teenage experts in the field of fan fiction from different regions of Russia. The analysis of the research results showed that the interest of school children in the phenomenon of fan fiction is explained by their passion for reading classical and modern literature, the practice of reading and writing in the space of fan fiction are for this category of school children is an important way of creative self-expression and reader communication. The choice of literary primary sources is determined by the ideological and content features of the work. The results of the survey also allowed us to conclude that teenagers have a positive attitude to the possibility of using this phenomenon in school and see its educational potential in a positive impact on the development. Interest in reading classical literature as the creation of fan fiction texts involves a reference to the reading of literary primary sources, the development of literary abilities and creative thinking, the development of cooperation between teenagers through their participation in the reading communication of the fan fiction community. To confirm the results, the author conducted a survey of 70 modern teachers from different regions of Russia. The criterion for selecting a group of teachers was the presence of ideas about the essence and content of fan fiction and interest in complementing the traditional pedagogical tools to introduce new classics to reading. The analysis of the results showed that modern teachers have a positive attitude to the possibility of using fan fiction in the educational process of the school and believe that fan fiction can be a tool that can influence the development of written language skills. Be aware reflection on what has been read motivate teenagers to read classical literature, develop communication and social skills of teamwork in the community, determine a deeper knowledge of the text of the work of art and the higher level of its understanding, as the creation of a fan fiction text implies a thoughtful reading of the literary source, analysis and search for the internal moments to continue the story. The results of the research, the expert opinion of teachers and school children, experts in the field of fan fiction within the framework of the solution of the fourth task of the dissertation allowed us to highlight the organizational and pedagogical conditions under which the use of the fan fiction tool for the introduction to the organizational and pedagogical conditions under the use of the fan fiction tool. These conditions were referred to as such: the choice of literature significant works for the creation of fan fiction texts, program works from school classics, development of tasks for working with fan fiction within the framework of lessons and extracurricular activities, organization of the readers' community, real and virtual, its support and development through the conduct of pedagogical events. In order to test the viability of these conditions within the framework of the fifth task of the dissertation, the author's model of introducing modern school children to reading classical literature with the help of a fan fiction tool was developed on the basis of the existing system of criteria and indicators of initiation to reading and science and the results of the empirical research. The criteria and indicators of effectiveness of this model were determined. Its testing was carried out within the framework of the educational process of Kaluga and St. Petersburg schools. To participate in the experiment, a group of teenagers with the most unstable attitude to reading was selected. These are the students of 7th and 8th grades, 176 people from the experimental group and 84 people from the control group. They had the tasks to get acquainted with the fan fiction, to try their hand at the roles of authors, editors, critics of fan fiction by means of the algorithm of action proposed in the dissertation, to create a virtual community, to develop the community within the framework of the sixth task of the dissertation, approbation of the proposed model. The system of tasks for work with fan fiction was developed. The result of this activity was an educational program of extracurricular activities of the mass online course, new practices of reading and creative writing, fan fiction. A virtual readership community was organized called territory of creativity, fan fiction, which includes more than 1,400 texts and fun fiction, where students had the opportunity to read, comment, participate in competitions and contests. Pedagogical events were developed and held. 2 all-Russian competitions of creative work, territory of creativity, fan fiction, and essay for those who do not want to part with the literary characters, which brought together concerned readers and school children from 11 regions of Russia and neighboring countries. To assess the effectiveness, the use of this model, we developed the author's diagnostic toolkit, which was aimed at measuring the level of initiation to reading before the experiment and after its completion on the basis of emotional and behavioral criteria. The use of the toolkit, including questionnaires, forms for evaluating personal achievements, maps of observations of the reading activity in the community, allowed the author to find out that the initial stage of the experiment, a very small percentage of teenagers were involved in reading classical literature. The results are presented on the slide. In the process of working with fan fiction sources at the following stages, when teenagers were introduced to the peculiarities of the genre and space of fan fiction, they began to actively create their own texts, were involved in the activities of the readers' community through their employment in extracurricular activities, and the indicators of their level of involvement in reading classics have changed. Based on the results of the testing of the developed model, an individual assessment of the level of initiation of reading classical literature was calculated for each participant of the experiment, which consisted of the sum of values of all the indicators of emotional and behavioral criteria, and was determined by the results of the survey analysis of questionnaires and forms to assess personal achievements of adolescents and observations in the virtual reading community. As a result, each pupil, depending on the amount of points, could fall into a group with a low, medium, or high level of involvement to reading. The slide shows the results of all participants by group before and after the study. The results show that during the time of participation in the experiment, the number of students with a high level of proficiency in reading classical literature has more than tripled. The number of teenagers with an average level of proficiency in reading has doubled, and the number of students with a low level of proficiency in reading classical literature has significantly decreased. Thus, the positive dynamics of the result made us sure that fan fiction can be an effective tool in involving school children to reading, and thus prove the main provisions of the hypothesis. Dear Chairperson and members of the Dissertation Council, I'm finished with my report. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now we have the opportunity to ask questions. Please, colleagues who have questions, you are welcome. Dear Yulia Lvovna, can you please tell me, as a person who has done that hand, probably you can say, what are reading activities among that you have mentioned that you activate in the process of your work were the most popular with the teenagers? You named the 7th and the 8th grade, that the crucial age for the reading. What types of reading activities were the most interesting for the teenagers, first of all? Natalia Mikhailovna Svirina. Dear Natalia Mikhailovna, thank you for the question. It is necessary to say that the most interest with teenagers who participated in the experiment was caused by the desire to get introduced to fan fiction because they listened to the texts that were created by their colleagues, and in the process of the work that took place at our lessons and extracurricular activities, they were interested to read the original works in order to try themselves to participate in creating their own authorized texts. Thank you. Maria Alexandrovna Chernyak. Dear Yulia Lvovna, I have the question to complement the previous one. From your experience, what texts of classical literature were the most interesting for teenagers in your method? Thank you, dear Maria Alexandrovna, for your question. To tell you the truth, the texts that can be basis for fan fiction, they are very diverse. The main thing here that the text has a very vast ideological basis and lots of plot gaps that were not developed by the author, so that the school child can find these moments and somehow continue and create the author text. Maria Alexandrovna asked what works were enjoyed by the children the most, which works of classical art. That was Mumu by Turgenev. It was one of the crucial works according to the number of texts created. Eugene Onegin, Ася by Turgenev, and many more other works. Thank you. Larisa Alexandrovna Darinskaya. Yulia Lvovna, can you tell me, please, what was the way of preparation of teachers, literary teachers, to conduct this work? Thank you, Larisa Alexandrovna, for the question. As for the teacher training, it was within the corporate training with the qualification awareness courses, where they learned what fanfiction was as the social and cultural phenomenon, where they learned from my experience and implement that in their practice. If there are any other questions, Leonid Sergeyevich Ilyushin. Yulia Lvovna, I have a question on the forming experiment. You were very precise about talking about how the attitude towards reading has changed among teenagers. Do you have any observations about the comprehension of parents of this new practice, because the experiment introduced to the practice of a teacher is always under the observation of parents? Thank you for your question. Yes, we do have this experience of communicating with parents whose children participated in the experiment, and that were positive feedback from the parents. They liked it a lot and they were very grateful, and they expressed their positive opinion about what their children were doing at the lessons of literature and extracurricular activities. And weren't there any parents that considered this, that were worried about this experiment, or that were skeptical about this? No, from my experience, I can say that there were no parents like that. I can say that you were very lucky. Bayan Uberbekovna, do you have any questions? No, thank you. If there are any other questions by the members of the council, or maybe those present, one small question. In your pilot research, there were 70 modern teachers participating. And what do you mean by the modern teachers? Do you mean in their mindset, in their age, or in their training experience? In this case, we can consider that modern teachers are our contemporaries. Thank you. If there are any other questions? If there are no other questions, I would like to shift to the reviews annunciation. And let us start with the external reviews. We have received 10 reviews. These are the reviews from the Doctor of Pedagogical Sciences, honored teacher of the Russian Federation, head of the Department of Russian Literature at Vyatsky State University, Galitskih. That's the review received from the deputy headmaster of the private school. The review signed by the teacher of Russian and literature of the highest qualification category, Lyceum number 1 in the city of Pushkin. The review received by the candidate of pedagogical science, Methodist from Kaluga State University, Proskurina. A review from the Doctor of Education, professor at the Department of Pedagogy, Surgut State University, Povzun. A review from the teacher of literature and Russian language of the highest qualification category, school number 37, Kaluga, Mitrofanova. A review signed by the teacher of literature and Russian language first qualification category, grammar school Molodechna from Belarus. The review signed by the candidate of pedagogical sciences, associate professor at the Department of Linguistics, State Tsiolkovsky University, Gavrichenkov. A review from the candidate of educational sciences, associate professor at the Department of Journalism and Media, St. Petersburg State University of Technology and Design, and the review from the teacher of Russian language and literature of highest qualification category from Altai Krai. All the reviews are positive. They support this dissertation and they highlight the sufficient scientific novelty and the crucial and vital character of the dissertation in the pedagogical context, and the novelty and the achievement of introducing the concept of fan fiction in teaching literature, and not only involvement to reading and general didactic and methodological issues. All the teachers who participated in this experiment and analyzed the dissertation, they highlight the pedagogical importance of the review, and they have certain questions and suggestions connected to the possibility of implementation of these methods from teenage group to other age groups. And as for the classical literature, probably it can be necessary to implement this with other types of literatures and methodology of fan fiction. And there are questions about the aspect that is being discussed by all of us on whether the introduction of fan fiction is the interest in classical literature but not in your personal creative process. And all the reviews are positive and they support this dissertation and research. And now we can move on to the reports from the dissertation council members. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Jolazbekova Bayan Olimbekovna. The floor is yours. Dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to work with such famous scientists and scholars. I'm happy to welcome you all. Now let me start with my review. The crucial character of the dissertation is organized by the pedagogical necessity to solve the problem of encouraging school children to read classical literature in the tendency of low and unstable interest of teenagers towards reading school classics. This problem is to be studied in a scientific way, and the new ways and methods of solving it should be found. As of the content of the pedagogical development in the introduction and encouraging school children to read classical literature and working out the necessary methodology and tools, the main factor defining the importance of the topic is to be considered the emergence of new literary practices and phenomena due to the development of the information culture of the 21st century, and thus the interest can be considered in the studying of pedagogical tools and using such literary events in trying to encourage modern school children to read. And from this position, the dissertation research of Mokshina, Yulia, Lvovna, dedicated to the fan fiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, can be considered a very vital, and the dissertation is characterized with the analysis of foreign and domestic literature on the issue researched, theoretical and methodological basis, scientific-based problem, and a vast empirical basis. And thus it can be positively considered for the whole line of research in taking into account the empirical and experimental basis. The structure is very well organized, and it is very logical in the purpose and objectives of the work. The author implements the hypothesis that allowed to develop theory, methodology, and activate the practice of using pedagogical tools of fan fiction in order to encourage modern children to read classical literature. It is necessary to highlight that the objectives of the task and provisions were very relevant, and theoretical and methodological basis is scientifically proven, and thus it influenced positively upon the logic of the research, taking into account the experimental part of the research. The apparatus part of the research states the main parts of the dissertation, and they all were used during the research. The novelty of the dissertation is reinforced through the achievement of the applicant in the development of the social and cultural concept as fan fiction, which is very popular among teenagers. And the scientific value is also presented in the organizational and educational tools of implementing fan fiction in order to encourage children to read classical literature, and the results that open the main concepts and possibilities of using fan fiction, the new perspective on encouraging children to read, and so on and so forth. And now I would like to turn to the practical importance of the work. It is presented through the educational issue of the question, taking into account the practical-oriented model and diagnostic toolkit of encouraging school children to read, and thus these methods can be used at developing online courses, module disciplines, and they can be implemented in the educational processes of various educational institutions. And thus we can make a conclusion that the author has a very high level of scientific competence, has professional mindset, and demonstrates a high level of conclusions, and thus the dissertation under review is very logical and precision of terminology, clarity of the provisions, discussions, and conclusions, and thus the dissertation work is to be considered as the finalized work that have the unified goals, and the results have the significant scientific novelty and practicality. The research is based on a high amount of initial data. It is written in a very understandable way, and in each chapter there are very precise conclusions. At the same time, let me make several comments. So first of all, the dissertation takes into account the potential for fan fiction. At page 81, it says that social cultural phenomenon of fan fiction has educational potential that can be described through the mix of the following characteristics: compliance with the original work of literature, and the possibility to inventarize the text and to provide with creative development. It is the tool for informal communication that allows to communicate among the colleague teenagers, but the author doesn't tell us whether it can be an impetus for further development of reading practices. In our point of view, the reference to fan fiction and using it as the tool to encourage school children to read classical literature implies a description of its professional potential as the possible motivator towards reading school classics. In the third chapter of the dissertation, within the framework of the implementation of this model, the author thoroughly describes the pedagogical experiment, describes the risks of this model, and with the fan fiction based method, but I would like to understand whether the risks were taken into account, so that, for example, when children do not have enough written skills. And the third part, the psychological comfort and satisfaction are a main provision for communication in every community. In the pedagogical experiment, it was not noticed, not observed whether the teenagers had psychological comfort and whether they were satisfied communicating in their virtual community, whether all the participants were engaged, fully engaged in the community. I would like to mention that the remarks expressed do not diminish the dissertation research, and this dissertation dedicated to fan fiction based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature comply with the regulation established by the order as of the 1st of September 2016 on awarding degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant is to be awarded a degree, qualification code 13.00.01, theory of education, history of teaching and education. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, dear colleagues. As of the order on the 1st of April 2019, as the member of the Dissertation Council, Yulia Petrovna Milentieva was made part of our Dissertation Council, member of the Russian Academy of Art, of Science, deputy chair on the problems of reading and honored worker of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and her review is also on the website. Unfortunately, she is unable to take part in our meeting, but I would like to read her review. So the dissertation involves the phenomenon of fan fiction, which is a new concept, and it is not studied in very classical dictionaries, and the author and other researchers considers fan fiction as the part of amateur literature, the creative space for self-development of the fandoms, and the key of fan fiction is the literary game creating of works and texts based on literature films using the plot of the original work, and the following discussion on the internet among the community of fans. And it is possible that the study of any phenomenon studied can be vital as it develops our knowledge of the phenomenon. Unfortunately, this phenomenon was not so well developed in our country, according to the author, and the most important fandom considers only 150,000 participants, and the deep character of the research cannot tell us that any new information was added, and the only novelty is the hypothesis that says that it is necessary and possible to use the fan fiction as the tool in order to engage school children to read Russian classical literature, and this task was not imposed on fan fiction. And the small scale and low scientific base is oriented and is somehow exposed in the dissertation, and it makes us think that the scientific novelty of the dissertation is not sufficient, and the names of the second and third chapters are tautological, and the phenomenon on fan fiction is studied on a very low and narrow basis. The concept within the concept itself. When discussing the encouraging school children to read classical literature, the author doesn't take into account the specifics of teenage culture and the specification of the contemporary situation. And it is necessary to say that the concept of fan fiction was studied by the author quite thoroughly, and following the research, the author agrees that fan fiction is a genre of amateur literature, a phenomenon of the so-called literary poaching, literary game, and we can agree with the author that it can add to the creativity process and self-development of teenagers. But the main peculiarity of fan fiction as the product of postmodernist mindset is the desire to subject the text, as many other researchers say, referring to the literary work. Fan fiction is the freedom of self-expression and element of cooperating culture, is aiming to dilute the border between the reader and the author, and usually fan fiction has to do with the popular culture and popular mass literature and is not part of the classical text sphere. That's why the hypothesis seems to be not based on any scientific evidence that fan fiction can be used as a tool to encourage children to read more classical literature, and the author connects this phenomenon with with new technologies of online education, and the third chapter of the dissertation is dedicated to the description of this, and the schemes and the tables and the empirical research, they cannot make us sure and make us believe, because the 70 participants of the teachers and school children cannot be considered within the scale of the experiment, and based on the research, the author creates the model of using fan fiction as a tool in order to encourage school children to read, and they presented examples of fan fiction produced by the teenagers may make us shocked and worried, and thus many researchers have already said that this genre implies the a desire of the producer to subject the author's work and deluge the borders between the author and the reader, and without the necessary attention towards the plot, it's been a parasite of the original text, and thus I think it does not encourage to read Russian classical literature, but very familiar attitude towards the author and the propagative relation to the classical literature. And how can we consider an author that is going to change the classical word of Eugene Onegin? It is the tasteless person, and we can only be surprised how the Russian World Fund could support this project, where the connection between the reader and the author is being ruined, because following the Western practices cannot always be the good for our education system, and the author calls for implementing this into the school program. But composition as the approved tool is not about being a parasite and delusion the borders between the reader and the author, but it checks the possibility of finding ideas and meanings of the text. It can be useful as the game, but we can see that it is very mistakenly leading way of attracting too much attention towards this phenomenon. And this genre is not part of the Russian mentality as far as the genre of comic books that were not widespread in the Russian classical literature. And we do understand that reading classical literature is not very popular with the teenagers, according to various surveys, is not very high, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the classic literature and the vulgar familiar relation towards the talent of the writer, but through the meticulous work of understanding the text and the meaning of certain words and the historical context, as Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva and Lotman were doing, and now Minkin, Bykov are doing right at the moment, and how it is produced in the modern literary books and textbooks. And I think that fan fiction based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature and the hypothesis made to reading, I think it is mistaken and full of errors, and it cannot contribute to the process of reading classical literature, and thus the model of using fact fiction as the pedagogical tool, as the author implies, can have a disastrous effect, and the dissertation does not comply with the main regulations stated by the Order of St. Petersburg State University. Thank you for the attention, and now I would like to give the floor to Larisa Darinskaya. Well, there's gonna be a huge contrast, I guess. Dear colleagues, dear applicant and members of the Dissertation Council, it's a very great honor for me to be part of the Dissertation Council and give a speech at this meeting. The actuality of the topic cannot be doubted. I read my review and I express my opinion, because nowadays, as we all know, in the intensification of the digital technologies development, it is obvious that it is necessary to keep the balance between the traditional and innovative approaches to education, taking into account the social and cultural context that is present nowadays, and it refers towards finding new ways of how to encourage modern children to read. It is known that there are certain issues, how to make it important for a child to read, how to activate them, how to make it an impetus for them. We have been discussing this issue for many decades, and that refers not only to the teachers but to the practicing teachers and Methodists, and we all know it very well. And thus we are looking for the new tools to involve modern children to read in classical literature, and that's why it takes a very important part in educational science and in our practice. It is a pivotal issue, and it is to be solved through the process of modernization of modern education system. The object of research are the educational capabilities and fan fiction role in involving children towards reading classical literature, and the applicant mentions that identification and analysis of the fan fiction potential can help implementing the environment in order to stimulate the creative activity of school children, and thus the role of fan fiction as social and cultural phenomenon is growing among other similar phenomena. And in the objectives part, the author mentions that implementing new readers' practices among modern teenagers that can be implemented through pedagogical following in the virtual environment are very difficult to follow, because nowadays pedagogical sciences do not have a uniform concept towards this process, and many productive ideas of practical teachers are not widespread in the mass practices of school education. Thus, there is a conflict between the theoretical knowledge about the fan fiction phenomenon itself and the educational practices and the pragmatically oriented practice oriented upon the exams in involving children to read classical literature with the standard methods of engaging children to read. And thus we can say that the scientific problem introduced by the author is very vital, because there is a contradiction, and the problem is the following: that we should find the educational possibilities as impetus towards encouraging school children to read classical literature. The applicant has meticulously studied the literature with the sources and references, and the applicant highlights that despite a vast number of research works in the process of literary education, the issue of using modern educational practices and readers' practices and fan fiction is not widely studied, and it is not very strictly studied. That's why it is very difficult to introduce that into the educational practices. And thus, through the solution of this problem, the author adds the knowledge to the theoretical basis in developing school children reading activity, and dissertation implies several new empirical methods. I won't dwell upon this. The author studied lots of references, and it shows a high intellectual level of the applicant and the acquaintance with the foreign sources as well, and it can show us that the author is very profound in the issue. And the key role of the dissertation is studying the concept of fan fiction and identifying the uniformity in encouraging towards reading, the content, the teacher's activity, or the choice of pedagogical toolkit, and in order to analyze the relations and attitude of school children and teachers towards this phenomenon, was carried out a survey taking into account school children and teachers, and all the participants have positive relation towards fan fiction, and they say that using this tool at school can have positive impact upon school children's interest in reading classical literature, and thus the basis allows us to identify the organizational environment that I won't dwell upon as well. They are very precisely highlighted in the text and in the presentation, and the author integrates the facts from the experiment into the pedagogical integrity, and thus finds a basis of tools for encouraging school children to read classical literature. And the applicant proves that the pedagogical modeling can help us highlight the most important connections and networks with the usage of the best practices only. Thus, the model developed by the author towards reading classical literature by using the fan fiction based method allowed us to find connections between the elements of informal literary institute and identify the environment of school children activities, and identify whether the result of following their work and their own experience a kind of accidental episode, or it's a characteristic of the process. And the applicant uses the systems of criteria and indexes that can help us follow how children are interested in reading classical literature. And the choice of criteria is to be based upon some facts and arguments and diagnostic tools. And thus I have the question about the correctness of several concepts. For example, satisfaction or pleasure shows emotional concept towards reading, and thus the second index should be involvement, that shows the time-consuming part of reading and pleasure from the reading process. Thus it can match the time-consuming index. And I doubt the concept that the reader feels the necessity from time to time, and the instrument and the experiment took part within 3 years, and 176 school children participated in it, with 84 control group children. And I would like to understand how you formed the groups, what were the tasks of the experimental and the control group. In the description, the author mentions that the work was done at the school and extracurricular activities and their individual work during holidays, and extracurricular activity became the basic organizational form for working of school children with the fan fiction based method. And within this framework it was the main work organized through this model. And in the dissertation we can read a very precise description of the school children activities and mass online course. And the question is how exactly the extracurricular activities were organized and how this type of activities complied with the educational problem was not very meticulously described. And thus I have the questions: how did they work at the lessons with different types of readers depending upon their reading activity? Is it possible to succeed in involving children towards reading only at lessons without organized extracurricular activities? And I think there is no description of how teachers can work to encourage children to read, because it is the teacher who is the main figure in implementing new tools in their educational process. And whether we can implement this degree, this experience, because it is creative experience and it is connected with the personality of a teacher and the environment and atmosphere in each school and in each academic environment. And I would like to hear the comments on these points. The main scientific results were the provisions on identifying the conditions of fan fiction and its polyfunctional character, about the broadening of possibilities of fan fiction methods. And it is obvious that the results, they make a certain achievement in this sphere, but the conclusions on the theoretical conclusions are mostly descriptive. As for the practicality, they are fully implemented in the appendices of the dissertation and the program of extracurricular activities. And I think that there is no very meticulous description of the process of how the school children were working and the potential of who was intended at encouraging school children to read. And I would like to say that the remarks, they do not diminish the dissertation, and it can be part of the discussion only. And in general, the dissertation is very precise, and in each chapter and in the work itself there are very precise conclusions. And the dissertation by Yulia Lvovna Mokshina on the topic fan fiction based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature complies with the basic regulations from the order of the 1st of September 2016, number 6824/1, on the awarding degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and thus the applicant is to be awarded the candidate of pedagogical sciences, qualification code 13.00.01, theory of education, history of teaching and education. Thank you for the attention. Thank you, Larisa Alexandrovna. Now I would like to give the floor to Natalia Mikhailovna Svirina. Dear colleagues, I think you won't doubt that I won't repeat the provisions from the previous review. And dear colleagues, I would like to highlight that every day makes our school children farther from classical literature, from reading, and from reading classical literature at 99%. That's why it is very important for me, any professional attempt in finding a new tool, technology, not a method yet, but in any case, I welcome this dissertation because it complies with the spirit of the teenagers generation that are discussed in this dissertation. And now I would like to turn to the fragments that won't collide with Larissa Alexandrovna's report. The dissertation work is dedicated to the usage of fan fiction as method to encourage school children to read classical literature and finding the pedagogical methods in reading classical literature. And the topic implies studying the phenomenological phenomenon of introducing children towards reading, and it is based on contemporary strategies that are used in educational process, and the author introduces us in the introduction part, taking into account the studies of new phenomenon in education is a very rare example of scientific studies. So I can say that the topic chosen by the applicant is very bold, is very contemporary and modern in terms of communication and choosing the works. And it is to be noted that it doesn't ignore the modern phenomenon and readers' practice, making it not just part of teenagers' communication, but part of the teacher's toolkit. And with the new paradigm of education, that the necessity to form of the valuable relation towards reading, this dissertation work is quite actual, and I can say that it can help us to work with the collisions that we have with the fan fiction, between the development of fan fiction and not very well studied phenomenon, between the potential of fan fiction and underestimation of this potential, and introducing children to reading classical literature, having the necessity to develop new reading practices and the lack of toolkit for the children environment in the virtual reality. And the contradictions show us that the scientific problem set in the dissertation is very actual, and the topic is of vital importance. And the hypothesis was also correctly formulated, because fan fiction does have the potential that can be activated and implemented by teachers in order to encourage school children to read classical literature, especially highly elevated classical literature. And the organization implies the possibilities for creative development and communication within the community of fan fiction, and the necessity to develop it in class and out of class. And I would like to mention some points that came to my mind while listening to other reviews. We as teachers, we are growing readers in their generation while they are in our hands, while they are in our teachers' hand. It seems to us that we can influence, and we can somehow influence towards the tastes or antagonistic viewpoints, but when they leave school, they can communicate, and they do communicate within their generation, making suggestions as the characters of Pushkin with the tastes of the generation. And I think that this reader practice is very good, as it makes a step for the school children, and the theoretical basis is very convincing for me as a Methodist who is involved in school activity. I understand that each tool involves many years of practice, and not only work of one specialist but many followers, and I cannot see the sense when we should consider the work to be implemented throughout the whole country, or the participation of teachers of all generations that might be welcoming only one technology. It is impossible in the modern school, as it is as polar as the relations towards the topic of this discussion and dissertation, and the objectives and goals and the subject and object are very laconic, and the style itself is very laconic, without repetitions. There is no anything unnecessary, and this work is written by the applicant herself, and I can congratulate the applicant with the dissertation. It has the introduction, 3 chapters, appendices, and the conclusion. But I would like to turn to the remarks and questions that deal with the most important thing for me as a methodological specialist, as teaching literature at school. And in the first chapter you have a review of scientific literature and characteristics of fan fiction, but it is unclear if there is a theoretical novelty. By choosing the work, what criteria can we choose in order to introduce the children to classical literature? Can we use the basic of this tool towards the culture of cooperation upon the next step of the development of digital technologies, or it will be necessary to start everything from the scratch at every stage? And in conclusion, I would like to say that my questions and those in the text of my review, they do not diminish my positive assessment of this work. I support it, and the dissertation by Yulia Mokshina, a fan fiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, complies with the regulations due to the order as of the St. Petersburg State Order on awarding degrees, and the applicant is to be awarded the candidate of pedagogical sciences with a specialization 13.00.01 theory of education, history of teaching and education. Thank you, Natalia Mikhailovna. And now I would like to give the floor to Maria Alexandrovna Chernyak. Thank you, Yelena Ivanovna. Dear colleagues, before I introduce my review, I would like to say that after listening to the reviews of my colleagues, within the past 2 years I've been the opponent at the dissertation of fan fiction for the 3rd time, and there are different specializations. I was an opponent to a philological work, to a culturological work, and for the first time to pedagogical work. And this proves the vitality and pivotal character of this work and its cross subject nature, because the communication character of the modern culture was changed, and thus it stimulated the emergence of new creative areas. And modern research, cross-subject research at the border of philosophical theology, pedagogical sciences, in the latest time, they are only making their first step to grasp this phenomenon, and the attempt of the applicant considers to be very important within the range of modern scientific works that pay attention towards marginalization and commercialization of modern works, and she takes into account the international and domestic sources and worked out her own approach towards studying the culture of fan fiction and the ways of constructing the text with the usage of paratext elements to form plot and ideas, and the dissertation is dedicated to solving a very important problem: how to encourage school children to read classical literature, because today the problem is of vital importance, not from the point of view of the social and cultural situation that tells us about the new readers' practices and phenomena, but from the point of view of strategic development of modern school that people in the academia have been talking about. And this tells us about the necessity of theoretical basis for encouraging school children to read in classical literature through the popular phenomena developed in the 21st century. And from this position, the dissertation dedicated to the scientific approval of this phenomenon as a pedagogical tool can be very vital. And the scientific toolkit is very logical and structural and shows the theoretically based logic of the work and the conclusions, and the structure consists of the introduction with the actuality and methodological apparatus of the 3 chapters, including the theoretical and empirical part. And the author also thoroughly studied the experiment and various concepts of fan fiction, and comes to the notion that this term can be identified as amateur literature and open creative space for self-development in the virtual context. And the dissertation compares various points of view towards the nature of this phenomenon and the historical development of this complex notion, and certain referative character can be approved because there are not so many domestic works dedicated to fan fiction. That's why the newest and cutting-edge studies is to be important. And the topic is very cross-subjective, and the author included the points of view not of the teachers but philologists, culturologists, folklore specialists and media specialists. The value of the research is that it identifies not just social and cultural character, but it states the pedagogical tools in order to introduce school children towards reading, and the author highlights the involvement of children through the institutional rules of fan fiction, the development of the writing practices, creating texts, and participating in community communication, and so on and so forth, as my colleagues have already mentioned. The author of the dissertation tells that fan fiction is an instrument to encourage school children to read classical literature through the following characteristics: complying the text with the literary source of a high value, the possibility to integrate the creative process of self-development and the work of art, the space for informal communication that can add to the communication of contemporaries, and the teacher is the facilitator in this process that can use fan fiction in pedagogical and educational process. And there is also a set of criteria in order to encourage school children to read classical literature, on basis of which we can see the levels of how the children were involved: low, medium, and high. And thus the scientific novelty of the dissertation is the following. She identifies the characteristics of fan fiction phenomenon, which is very important and popular with teenagers. It is also described as the tool of creating amateur literature and open creative space for self-development, the authors of fan fiction texts, and she broadens the horizons of the phenomenon as it can be used as a pedagogical tool. The theoretical basis is also contributed through the modern knowledge about the essence and the methods and possibilities that can be used, referring to the problem of encouraging school children to read classical literature. And I would like to highlight the high level of practical importance, the model worked out in the dissertation and the program of extracurricular activity of the mass online course, new practices of reading and writing fan fiction, and the complex of diagnostic methods can be used in the work of educational institutions. And the main provisions are not to be confronted, but I would like to dwell some discussional moments. First of all, the cross-disciplinary work makes us think about the cross-literature work and sociology work, and I would like you to introduce the works of Professor Dobbin concerning the notions. And as for the implicit reader, is the instantiation referred from the text that influences the comprehension of the, and Umberto Eco tells us about the model reader, Wolf about the imaginary reader, and Bakhtin about the immanent listener. And Umberto Eco in his work on the readers makes out the model of imaginary reader that can interpret the sense as the writer introduced them, and the perception shows how the concept is being developed based on the principle of productivity, of co-creative activity, of the comprehensive mind. That's why the question is, how can we identify the type of the reader of fan fiction? It is necessary to show why in the first chapter there is no description of the second empirical part of the dissertation, and the experimental work took 3 years to complete. And the length of the study helped us to invite students of different grades. That's why 176 school children participated with control group of 84 children. That's page 107. And later you describe the experiment with the teenagers of 7th and 8th grade. Can we use it only with these category of teenagers? And the fourth, the text of the dissertation tells us that modern school children create different types and genres of fan fiction, and you show the example of texts created by modern school children. Can we consider this list representative? And I should say that the remarks and interventions, they do not diminish the high assessment of the work and its scientific and practical importance. And the dissertation by Mokshina Yulia, a fan fiction based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, complies with the order of St. Petersburg State University, Order 6824/1 on awarding degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant is to be awarded a scientific degree, candidate of pedagogical sciences, qualification code 13.00.1, theory of education, history and teaching and education. Thank you, Maria Alexandrovna. Leonid Sergeyevich Ilyushin, the floor is yours. Dear colleagues, the report by the applicant and the indirect discussion of the report allows me to express first and foremost from the following point of view: entering the problem of the dissertation and the beginning of the scientific research is possible through alternative paths. It is either a continuation of the academic path, first as the holder of higher education degree and the following path of postdoctoral education, or it can be a professional path when the applicant decides first of all to publish the results of the pedagogical activity. And Yulia Lvovna is the second type of the applicants, and it seems to me that the topic of her research and the result are defended through the pragmatical nature, because the practical teacher who is solving the issues that become the goal of the study introduce us to the successful and ambiguity of the practice that he or she witnessed himself, but the analytical character of this practice. And I would like to mention that, taken into account one of the classical definition of pedagogic as the science encompassing science, art and practice, I would like to say that she is very successful in art and practice and is going to perfectly comply with the third one. The combination of values and subjective approach and state approach with result make us very doubtful about the task, and this dissertation is trying to combat this ambiguity through introduction of the social and cultural phenomenon that is to be identified as the creative reading. The main science of the work is the argumentative character of introducing the notion of fan fiction to the terminology of teachers and encouraging through the practical motivation of teenagers to creative reading and writing, and it is very well formed in the third chapter and the appendices of the work of this 5-year study. And I would like to dwell upon the main elements of the work and the provisions for defense. The provision for defense, there are 5 of the theses in the logic of the study, and the first provision opening the core of the fan fiction is part of the reference towards the pedagogical, philological and culturological works in the study, and the point of view of the author towards the notion of fan fiction in the space of the reader's culture, and thus the reasons why fan fiction is very important for young teachers, for young readers, and communication within the fan fiction is a very important resource for making the practical result of the work in the third chapter. And taking into account the first provision for defense and the first chapter, it is necessary to highlight the very important conclusion at the end of paragraph 1.2 at page 44. This structure basis for virtual communities of fan fiction is the social time that implies the formation of active cycles, interpersonal and intergroup communication. And it seemed to us that this thesis approves the number of results as of the methodological basis for the usage of fan fiction in school education. the development of extracurricular activities is a very productive way from the point of view of modernization of didactic path of the school. And the second provision for defense is about the educational potential in encouraging to read, and this provision shows the results and consequences of the dissertation. For us, it is very important, the thesis of the author, to have a space and reason for informal communication that makes this digitalization and socialization possible, and the development of imperative tone. It is this reason of the author about the importance for reason for informal communication is to be very important for both school and society. And the third definition is the implementation of fan fiction practices in the third paragraph, and is developed in the third chapter. And the author introduces the idea that the support of this community is only possible through their real communication. And as for the hypothesis formulations, there is the necessity to combine real and virtual practices, and this is a recommendation. And if you read the appendices, the methodological program that is followed by the author herself, and provisions 5 and 4 show the results of the experiment at the third part of the stage, and the logic of the final and intermediate parts show us the high methodological competence of the author, and the connection with the control and experimental groups can be the basis for longitude research, and the criteria for the assessment and efficiency assessment is also very laconic. There are only 3 criteria. It's the positive part of the work, because it allows the practical teachers to focus upon the process itself, that is the voluntarily enlargement of time consuming, and the choice of the works, and the involvement of school children in their readers' communication. And analyzing the first provision and coming back, and I would like to introduce several remarks that do not refer to the previous reviews, and I would like to announce them. First of all, in the text of the dissertation, there are 2 author notions of fan fiction within the teacher's framework, and I think these notions are contradicting towards each other. The first one, that fan fiction is a polyfunctional notion, taking into account the instrument of the genre for creative space, for self-development of the representatives of modern culture through the creation of amateur texts based on the original and literary works, page 29. The second one is fan fiction is the result of the inner emotions from the literary source and the reader's transcription, and that is at page 59. And I think that the contradiction is that in the first part you talk about the open creative space, and in the second one you talk about the inner emotions, and which of the aspects is the most necessary and which one is sufficient. The second remark can be formulated in the following part. In table at page 71, table number 1, there are lines combining the tendencies of development and strategies of the educational process, goals and concepts, and their characteristics of fanfiction tool. And it is unclear, the logic of the author is the unclear. when the author combines automatization and the creative independency in the project-oriented activity. I think it's a little bit artificial. And the third remark, at page 83, there is the result of the questionnaire of how fan fiction influences the development of the language practices, and all teachers, they were the teachers of the school children during the territory of creation, compositions for those who do not want to part with literary characters. And 29% consider that the usage of fan fiction practices of encouraging school children to read classical literature is not very effective. And if the teachers participating were the teachers of these very children who participated in the experiment. And this leads us to the following question: whether the teacher should be an author of the fan fiction texts. And at page 105, the author introduces one of the statistical results, the integral assessment, the level of how children were involved, defining that as the qualitative equal to all the sum indexes. And the term integral assessment is used as a metaphor. I think it is not correct to use this term because the integral assessment is a more complicated notion. The remarks, they do not diminish the impression of the dissertation by Yulia Mokshina, a fan fiction-based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature, complies with the main regulations as of the order from the 1st of September 2016 on the procedure of awarding degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant is to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Pedagogical Sciences, Qualification Code 13.00.01, Theory of Education, History of Teaching and Education. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce my review. We have listened to several reviews already, and I won't dwell upon what was said. And I would like to highlight that the research is dedicated to a very acute issue of keeping the reader's culture in the environment of mass digitalization of our society. And the fan fiction is discussed in this dissertation, and I think it's a very bold statement, and the attempts to introduce this notion to educational science. And I think that fan fiction in domestic practice is the same as edutainment, because it goes further, and it is not yet the Russian term has not yet emerged in order to describe this reality. And I think that upon the border of real and virtual processes, we will be able to face the new practices in a very weird and mixed language. And I would like to thank Maria Chernyak for the linguistic on introduction words, fandoms, fan fiction, and fanfictors, and the context of their usage in the academic texts. And I think that the author introduces a very bold hypothesis, saying that fan fiction has a potential that can be used to encourage school children to read classical literature. From my point of view, there were two groups of the results achieved in this work that can classify that as a very independent scientific research. First of all, the applicant meticulously describes the institutional character of fan fiction. I won't call it a reference study. I think we deal with the institutional analysis, and in this case the author describes the space of fan fiction as the system of informal instrument functioning as the emotional, appealing and attractive for the readers' community, and the role structure of communication and relations, author, critic, editor, and communal activity. And I can agree with the fact that the desire of teenagers to save the character and to rewrite the ending of a favorite character was also a characteristic part for pre-digital society, and that was the reasons for that were the emotional immersion into the literary work and the creative potential, and the desire to still be with the favorite characters and not to part with them. And it is clear that the digital development augmented this desire and developed through the fandoms. And the second result is connected with the fact that fan fiction has a very high educational potential. And from my point of view, the fan fiction leads to the development of the reader practices and readers' communication, and we can agree with the author with her with her conclusion that there is a connection between fan fiction and the involvement of children into reading classical literature. And within the framework of the research, they worked out the virtual community based on fandom principle, and 2 all-Russian projects were implemented: the territory of creativity, an essay for those who do not want to part with the literary heroes, with 453 school children participating from 15 Russian regions. And the analysis tells us that the goal was reached, and the work has theoretical and practical importance, and the results can be considered valuable and viable, and it was implemented into the practice as well. And as any full research, I cannot help adding my remarks. And first of all, the school children were discussed, for whom fan fiction can become a tool to involvement into reading. Is it effective for all groups of school children? Because this issue wasn't studied, because we are talking about young teenagers, how these readers were prepared for reading and how it influences their desire for self-development. And if there are any teenagers who do not want to be engaged in the process, and how should we work with them? And as for the personality of a teacher who work with the fan fiction and be productive, because I think not all the teachers might work with that. Unfortunately, this was not addressed in the dissertation. The third question about the classical literature, and here we should be solid with those who say that fan fiction is a very peculiar tool and cannot be used with all classical works. And what are the risks of using this experiment? For example, the risk of vulgarization, or the risk of spoiled literary language or spoiled taste when the response of the reader is being equalized to the work of art. And maybe it is a mistaken task in the formation of the reader's taste. But I can say that the remarks do not underestimate the importance of the research, and I think that the work complies with the regulations, and the applicant is to be awarded a degree of Candidate of Pedagogical Sciences. Thank you, dear colleagues. If there are any registered for the questions. Now I would like to give the floor to the applicant with the answer to the response. Dear Madam Chair, dear members of the Council, thank you for the thorough analysis of my work, and let me address the questions asked. The questions by Bayan Umirbekova. We take into account the idea that fan fiction can be a tool to motivate modern school children. It was studied as part of the experiment, but was not identified in the dissertation, and we will take that into account. As for the risks, they were identified at page 131 of the dissertation: engagement in extracurricular activities with the basic of creative writing skills. As of involvement of school children in the fan fiction, and with the results achieved, all the school children felt psychological comfort and were satisfied with the virtual fan fiction. As for the result at the final stage, all the teenagers were engaged in the activity. As of Yulia Petrovna Milentieva, I would like to thank Yulia Petrovna for the attention towards the dissertation, and let us address the critical remarks. In our opinion, the statistics and the facts can tell us that fan fiction is very popular among the world, and this is proven through the historical development of the fan fiction since the 20th century. And fan fiction is the informal community, and that's why we cannot compare that to the officially registered libraries. And taking into account that scientific novelty is one of the main requirements for the dissertation, implying that the dissertation should have the solution of the new tasks and broadening the horizons of a certain science, it tells us that this dissertation provides a view upon the dissertation, and the definitions are given with the use of fan fiction based method. The logic of the dissertation was also addressed through the following issues. In the first chapter, what is fan fiction and why it involves so many people around it? The second chapter, what educational possibilities can fan fiction produce for encouraging school children to read, and how can we implement that in our teaching practice? That's why I would like to accept the remarks, but we cannot agree with the fact that the scientific problem of the dissertation can be only covered by the first chapter. As for the theoretical and methodological basis, it consists of 11 groups of scientific works, and reading classical literature is analyzed in the introduction and within the part of the empirical studies in the chapter 2. And the main task of the dissertation is to work out and implement the tool of fan fiction. The main goal of the dissertation was to describe fan fiction as the tool to encourage reading, a category that has a very specific scientific discovery, and the correction and the ruining borders between the reader and the author does not have anything to do with this category. At page 34 and 35, it is said that among the literary works that are the basis for fan fiction are the works of Russian and world classical literature, and the results of the research show us that the most of the fandoms are the works of the Russian and international classical works. At the different stages of the research, more than 600 school children in the age of 14 and 15 years old participated, and that's why the scale is very representative in this case. And I cannot agree with the opponent with the fact that the fictional writer takes into account only the plot without the ideological sense, because while working in the fan fiction tool in teaching practice, it is the vice versa process. The task of the teacher is to actualize the knowledge, and the task of the school child is to read the work of art and create the text that can be interesting for the fellow readers, and thus it implies the immersion into the plot of the work, because without this it won't be valuable for the participants of the fan fiction community, and it won't be popular and accepted. The remarks by Darinskaya Larisa Alexandrovna. As for the correct nature of notions and definitions, we took into account the criteria and indexes that were corrected for the specific nature of this experiment, and we can agree with the remarks about the notions and definitions, and we will take that into account in the future. As for the experiment choice, we have chosen a group children with different attitudes towards reading, from being very interested and with very negative relation. And we had the following tasks: to introduce them to the fan fiction, to make them be readers, editors, to develop communication, and participate in contests and projects on reading. As for the organization on the learning activity, the teenagers were given tasks to write the texts, and it implied the following: reading and discussion of these texts at the lessons, where students with writing and learning disabilities were able to hear, to listen to their fellow colleagues, and then refer to reading the original work and create their own text and publish it within the community. And school children were introduced to the group tasks that implied the participation of several editors, authors, and thus we were able to actualize the teenagers with low interest in reading classical literature, and it took part during the reserve and lessons in the Russian language and literature, because it is necessary to simplify the algorithm, and the positive results will be achieved anyway. As for the lack of description of a teacher's work, taking into account that the goal of the dissertation was to show the involvement of school children into reading classical literature, the teacher was beyond our importance. Its activity is referred to in the framework, so we will take that into account, and we take into account the character of theoretical consequences. One of our objectives was to systemize knowledge on fan fiction, and we hope that the dissertation proves the theoretical importance of the results. As for the full description of the students' work, we made an attempt to address the main issue of what fan fiction was, as encouraging to read Russian classical literature. The main issue of what distanced us from the issue of how it works. In our opinion, it is mostly connected with the methods of teaching than with the theory of education, but we will address that in the future. As for Natalia Mikhailovna Svirina, about the scientific discovery, the discovery of the first chapter is that for the first time we analyzed the research on the fan fiction and introduced the structure character of this phenomenon. And there is no anything like that yet. And with the results presented at page 77, we can say that the teacher can choose works from the school classics and from the free program. As for keeping or recharging of the technology, taking into account the virtual specification, I can say that it won't be fully changed. I think there may be some minor improvements, and this can influence the algorithm introduced by the dissertation. By the whole recharge is not to be talked about. The experience of modern research shows that the model can be described through the stage, and thus we can find in the dissertations by Gorodinkina, Simoshkina, Polavinka. And as for ignoring the position of an author, this risk can be minimized through the reader's community and the following of the teacher. About the SWOT analysis, in the first draft of the dissertation, the third chapter presented the SWOT analysis, but the logic of the research didn't allow us to include it in full into the work. At page 132-135, we can agree with the remark, and we will be more attentive. Maria Alexandrovna Chernyak, the types of the readers of fan fiction. In our opinion, it is very difficult to address this question because we can call some model readers who are looking for the ideals of the authors, and somebody can be an archi reader who can broaden their horizons on the original work, and in a lesser extent the readers can be called an immanent towards the work, because the fandom reading leaves its influence. As for the lack of the empirical description in the introduction, the empirical description is only mentioned at page 10, and it is presented in the second and third provision for defense. We thought that it was enough. As for the age of the teenagers, there were teenagers from the 8th and the 7th grade that took part in the experiment, and the school children of the 6th and 5th grades and 10th and 11th grade. And our experience showed that all teenagers are prone to writing fanfics, so we can refer all different types of teenagers. As for the genre of the fan fiction, the most important types of fan fiction, and this classification is very vast, I can say. As for the questions of Leonid Ilyushin about the ambiguity of notions, our experience and result make us think that from the two notions that you named, in the process of encouraging school children to read classical literature, the first notion is quite sufficient, as the second is only complementary to the first. As for the table 1 at page 71, the line of connection from automatization towards forming the community of included readers, the author was guided by the idea that to create the fandom, it was necessary to involve the skills of programming to create a website, and I should have more precisely formulate this connection. That's why I take into account this research. As for the participants of the survey, they were the teachers of the school children participating in the contest, and most of them at that time they had a very short-term experience of working with fan fiction, and I think that the answer shows that in the following time, in the meantime, this opinion was changed. And as for the integral assessment, we can agree with the misusage of this term, and it is understood as metaphorically, and it was used to show the sum of the emotional criteria. As for the questions of Yelena Ivanovna Kazakova, the question of the teenagers, I have already mentioned that. I won't dwell upon this issue once again. The role of the teacher. In order to organize the work with the fan fiction, it is necessary to have the requirements at page 100, and you don't have to participate in the fandom. And as for the tools of fan fiction, and this issue was not researched, but the experience of colleagues showed that the consequences can be used towards the literature on the whole. About the risks, in order to minimize the risks, it is necessary to use all the resources of fan fiction, institutional structures, implying the work of readers, editors, and critics in the community. The discussion of the text within the community helps to minimize risks named by Yelena Ivanovna, because at the discussion the author is given practical results on development of the text and the reader's activity and the pedagogical activity at class discussions. As for the external reviews, dear chairperson, I will address towards the questions that have not been mentioned yet. As for Natalia Yurievna Proskurnina, about the reading texts of the fan fiction, the results show that the reader of fan fiction can be introduced towards the original text, can be done after they read the fan fiction, and it helps to develop the opinion of the original text. As for Marina Vasilievna, about the reflection and the analysis, the results show that the creation of the text is followed by the analysis of the source text. About the instrument as the tool of encouraging to read was not the main issue of the dissertation, but fan fiction can solve these issues as well. About the contradiction between the genre and the pedagogical effect, our task was to make it possible to turn modern school children into the fans of the cultural texts, motivating them towards reading classical literature. And the issue about the notion of fan fiction, the results shows that the notion of fan fiction in creating texts on the basis of the classical literature do not contradict the current notion. Thank you for the attention. Thank you, Yulia Lvovna. If there are any participants who would like to give a talk, no, thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to the scientific consultant of the applicant, Tatiana Yevgenievna Galaktionova. Please, welcome. Dear colleagues, I am fully convinced that the dissertation completed by Yulia Mokshina characterizes her as a very professional researcher and a person who has the scientific boldness, and this characteristic was introduced 4 times, and I can fully agree with that, and with the refined hard work and the novelty and the actuality of the topic is very basically presented by the applicant, as well as the research and the objectives and tasks, and the applicant introduces a very constructive hypothesis, and it is based on a complementary character of the systemic and phenomenological character, and it shows a high range of domestic and foreign works. And the research took several stages since 2013, and it has a wide geography, 15 regions. That is a lot, and it is very representative within the reviews. They were very different numbers, and I tried to make my own mathematical calculations, taking into account virtual and real participants, and not less than 1,000 participants that I have identified. The practical and empirical novelty is undoubtedly expressed in this work, with the knowledge about the possibilities of fan fiction and the problems of introduction of children towards reading and the possible ways of their development, the usage of fan fiction as the pedagogical tool, and the principles and forms and technologies of projecting and usage of the models of encouraging school children to read with the use of this method. And it seems to me that the results achieved can identify a high level of practical importance in solving the issues of involvement into the reading in class and out of class, and can be used in the qualification, refinement, training. Dear colleagues, the research shows the considerable scientific potential of the applicant, and the dissertation on the topic fan fiction based method of encouraging school children to read classical literature complies with the regulations of the scientific order of St. Petersburg State University on awarding degrees, and the order is to be awarded with the degree. As a scientific consultant, I ask you to support this work. Thank you, Tatiana Gelievna. Now we would like to turn to the stage of discussion, and I would like to turn off the broadcast. And all the present guests and colleagues who are not the members of the Dissertation Council, please leave the hall. I will invite you after the discussion is over. The broadcast is off.
Бековна, мы продолжаем. Спасибо большое. Заседание продолжается.
I would like to continue our meeting. Please turn on the broadcast and make sure that it works. And now it is the crucial moment of the meeting of the Dissertation Council. Thank you. Now I would like to invite you to the open roll call, and I would like to remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council is considered positive if more than the half, but not less than the 2/3 of the Dissertation Council members participating in the Dissertation Council meeting voted for that according to the order on awarding scientific degrees in the St. Petersburg State University. Ilyushin Leonid Sergeyevich, your opinion. I vote for awarding a degree. Darinskaya Larisa Alexandrovna, council member. I vote for. Thank you. Svirina Natalia Mikhailovna, your opinion, please. I vote for. Thank you. Chernyak Maria Alexandrovna, council member, your opinion. Undoubtedly, I support and vote for. Thank you. Joldasbekova Bayan Umirbekovna, your opinion, please. I vote for. Thank you. I, chairperson of the council, Kazakova Yelena Ivanovna, vote for. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, I would like to announce that out of 6 present council members, 6 voted for, no one abstained, and no one voted against. And thus, the decision is made to award the candidate of science in the specialization 13.00.01, Theory of Education, History of Teaching and Education, to Mokshina Yulia Lvovna. I would like to congratulate you, Yulia, and I would like to congratulate your scientific consultant, and I would like to give the floor to you. Thank you a lot. To recapitulate, I would like to address the words of gratitude to those who supported me, and it is due to my mother that I achieved this goal, and her wisdom assisted me a lot, and I think that she can be proud with me. And I would like to thank all my friends and fellow members and colleagues, because without their support it would be very difficult for me. And thank you to the Institute of Pedagogics, because I'm so happy to meet very interesting colleagues and teachers. Thank you for your support and assistance, and thank you to the Dissertation Council members for your analysis of my dissertation, for the suggestions and interventions and wishes that will become the basis for further research. And thank you those all present here, and I would like to thank in a special way to my scientific consultant Tatiana Gelievna Galaktionova. I would like to thank you for your care and patience, and I would like to comply with this degree and continue developing modern science. Thank you. Thank you, Yulia Lvovna. I would like to congratulate you once again. The meeting is considered closed. Please turn off the broadcast. Thank you everyone for participation. Goodbye, dear colleagues.